Hi again. In Armageddon Now, page 205, more speculation about Russia, Israel, and the United States, and Antichrist from the 1960s and 70s. Dwight Wilson says another adjunct of the anti-Russian attitudes among premillenarians during the late 1960s and early 70s was the growing concern about Soviet anti-Semitism. Due to the protest of world Jewry, it became a newsworthy issue, and premillenarians made the most of it as a sign of impending conflict between Russia and Israel. There was, however, virtually no program of opposition to the Russian anti-Semitism. Curiously enough, the Russians in this case were not subjected to the standard of ethics. Since American interests were not at stake this time, the premillenarians returned to the pre-World War II standard of sometimes tolerating Russian developments in a deterministic frame of reference as they usually tolerated Israel. The groundwork for this predisposition had been laid in the early 1960s. This anti-Semitism persistently was spoken of as a normal phenomenon. An article in The King's Business in 1960 referred to the coming time of Jacob's trouble, when more Jews would perish than had been liquidated under Hitler. Another article, a couple of years later, spoke of anti-Semitism as a potent force in stimulating the continuing restoration of the Jews. Besides being something to be expected, anti-Jewish feeling was still depicted as a well-deserved punishment. A 1964 article on the future glory of Israel exulted, "Well may every believer today praise God for his great people and promise concerning Israel." But then drew the contrast. Quote again, "Well may every Jew ponder the decision of the Rabbinical Council in rejecting their Messiah almost 2,000 years ago and bringing such suffering upon this poor nation, while the Gentile nations have entered into Israel's blessing." End of quote. Louis T. Talbot, now the Chancellor at Biola, did not focus upon the crucifixion of Jesus, but rather upon Israel's apostasy in general as the source of her just chastisement. President John F. Walvoord of Dallas Theological Seminary, on the other hand, blamed the Jews' troubles more directly upon Satan than upon God's chastisement, saying, "It should be noted that through the centuries, the trials of Israel have stemmed from the basic conflict between divine purpose and satanic opposition. The very fact that God selected Israel as a special means of divine revelation has made the nations the object of special satanic attack." End of quote. Both men, most likely, would have glossed over this apparent disagreement by explaining that God had allowed Satan's attack as a just punishment, but still one wonders which came first, the satanic attack or the decision to sin. Whichever way the premillenarian might view it, anti-Semitism was still a product of the great forces of the universe at work. For Christians to get involved in a great humanitarian struggle against it would be pointless. As the issue of Soviet anti-Semitism gained popular interest, evangelist C.M. Ward in 1971 accused the Russians of using their anti-Semitism to blackmail the Arabs. Quote, "In essence, Moscow blusters towards Araby. If you're having trouble with 2 or 3 million Jews in Israel, how would you like to face the release of 3 million more from within our border, that is, Russia's border?" Ward explained that this was one of the devices Russia was using to expand her power in the Middle East. A few months later, in Fuses Ignited, Explosion Ahead, Ward charged, quote, "The leaders of the Kremlin are seeking favorable world opinion that will permit aggression toward Israel. It is the same virus, anti-Semitism, now as in Tsarist and Stalinist times. Anti-Semitic incitements are the desperate resort of frightened men." Soviet leaders are gingerly testing world sentiment. They want to ascertain whether a world will stand by numbly and allow a repeat of Nazi crimes against Jews, a wholesale butchering. Will the world dismiss it as a Jewish problem? So the uneasy status remains within the Soviet border until this finding is made, a kind of permanent home arrest for all Soviet Jews. And that's the end of the Ward quote. Wilson says admittedly these are overly dramatic expressions, but they illustrate, Nevertheless, the premillenarian penchant to treat the issue not as a problem to be solved, but as a foreboding sign of the end, a sign to be expected and welcome, since it was prophesied. This attitude was not universal among premillenarians, however, as the editors of Christian Life in 1974 opened their pages to an appeal by Harold B. Light, the chairman of the Bay Area Council on Soviet Jewry and national chairman of the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews. In his article, "Let My People Go," he pleaded for Christians to persuade their congressmen to use economic pressure on Russia to wring concessions for the Russian Jews. This could possibly be interpreted as a symptom of a growing neo-evangelicalism, which demonstrated some humanitarian concern and social action in spite of the social gospel onus, but more likely it was only one small cry in the wilderness, not an omen of a popular groundswell of premillenarian social involvement. That's one of the backstories here in everything Wilson analyzes, is at the point at which he writes this book in the late 1970s, evangelicals haven't really become politically involved. That will change, however, in the Reagan era. I'll put in a link to a commentary we did, and I think it's about 5 videos altogether. I'll put the first on the screen. It's entitled "How an Earthquake Shook 2 Jehovah's Witnesses Out of the Watchtower," and it's about the great earthquake predicted in Zechariah chapter 14, which also predicts from 12 through 14, really, those last 3 chapters of Zechariah, that one day all nations will assemble for war against Jerusalem, and the Lord will intervene personally. See you next time.